How's everyone who's watching this? This is my 42nd video on the channel, and today, as you all can probably tell, we're going to be doing something a bit different from usual. Essentially, I want to start a series where I'd look at some of the shorts I make and explain them in a bit more detail than is possible with a format of only 1 minute. In this episode, we'll be looking at Freud's concept of Verwerfung, Wilhelm Reich's notion of character armor, D&G's Ritournelles, Jacques Lacan's point de caption, and Felix Guattari's Existential Territories. I'm still a bit strapped for time, so I can't look at them in too much detail, but I hope videos like this will act as helpful introductions to some of the concepts important to psycho and schizoanalysis. Without further ado, what exactly is Verwerfung? Please apologies for my pronunciation. Translated in the Standard Edition as repudiation and by Lacan as foreclosure, this is one of the many ways the ego defends itself from unpleasure. As you all can see in this diagram, it functions through taking an idea seen as dangerous or incompatible and dispelling it from the unconscious. Unlike other defense mechanisms like repression, this expulsion is complete. The ego essentially acts as if the idea never existed at all. In other words, there are no remnants of it left, no hidden memories, just an absence. In Lacan's eyes, this process is central to the development of psychosis. He suggests that what is foreclosed is none other than a master signifier, a point around which what he calls the symbolic order is constructed for each individual. To give some context, this refers to the realm of language, social conventions, meaning, and so on and so on. As can be seen here, it's thus that foreclosure involves creating a hole in the symbolic, one that cannot be filled. For Lacan, this operation constructs what he calls the clinical structure of a psychotic. This is one of the 3 categories that everyone falls into, along with neurosis and perversion. Although perhaps not as common as the first of these structures, many people have this foreclosed hole. However, not all of those experience the symptoms classically associated with psychosis. The reason why is linked to how delusions and hallucinations develop. Essentially for Lacan, their psychogenesis lies in the inability for those with a foreclosed master signifier to deal with it when they come into contact with it again. Due to its complete expulsion, it's impossible for the psychotic subject to incorporate it. To give an example, let's take a look at Freud's 1894 paper, The Neuropsychoses of Defense. Here, he describes a patient who, one-sidedly, fell in love with a young man who visited her home. Day after day, she waited for him to return, just to find disappointment. Eventually, to deal with these implausible thoughts of abandonment, she completely foreclosed them, forcing them out of her mind. However, when she singled out a date for his arrival and he didn't come, she was once again faced with feelings of disappointment. Since she had already foreclosed the possibility of them occurring, she was unable to handle them. Instead, she dispelled the situation and the unpleasure it brought by hallucinating his voice. It's in this way that foreclosure goes hand in hand with psychosis, Lacan going as far as to say that it is the defining feature of the structure, like repression for the neurotic. On this note, let's shift our focus to Wilhelm Reich's concept of character armor. This, it must be said, is a rather tricky thing to define, in large part due to the massive changes that Reich's thought underwent as he shifted away from psychoanalysis and towards orgonomy and biophysics. For the sake of specificity, I'll be focusing on the more somatic side of the idea that he developed later on. Just keep in mind that it's a bit broader when using the context of the first 2 essays in character analysis. With that out of the way, Reich saw the body itself as the locus of certain psychological defenses. As I said in the short on character armor, for him, the body keeps score. Anxiety is kept at bay by storing it in what he calls segments, things like the ocular armor ring composed of the forehead, eyes, and cheeks, and the oral armor ring of the lips, chin, and jaws. In his eyes at least, these segments are not tied to specific muscles or sets of nerves. Instead, they are semi-independent. Something Reich says can be seen in how blushing, sometimes associated with hysteria, occurs only in the ocular armor ring, rather than spreading to other parts of the body. Getting into a pseudoscientific theory of orgone, a kind of radicalization of Freud's notion of libido that turns it from a psychical energy to an actual bodily one, Reich says that it flows through the body as seen in this diagram. The armor essentially acts to constrict the flow, maintaining neurosis in the process. It's thus that a major aim of vegetotherapy, the form of body-based therapy developed around these notions, is the dissolution of the character armor. To expand on why he calls it character armor specifically, he essentially sees different ways of organizing these segments as connected to specific types of people and disorders. For example, the blushing we saw characterizes hysteria, or the blankness that he links to the ocular armor ring of schizophrenic patients. In other words, flat affect. An important part of Reich's form of psychoanalysis involves working out the character of a patient and interpreting the transference, dreams, and associations connected to them accordingly. Turning back now to how dissolving the character armor can unfold, vegetotherapy involves relaxing the muscles and other such components that are made rigid and tense by the storing of anxiety and trauma. To use the example of the ocular armor ring once again, this might involve practicing expressing emotions, like the patient opening their eyes wide as if in fright. The goal is to allow a release of some kind, like crying. However, no armor segment is an island. They're all closely interconnected. For example, crying won't necessarily be possible just because the ocular ring has been relaxed. Instead, it's also important to undo the next of the segments, the oral armor ring we talked about earlier. Even then though, Reich says that enough tension in the lower segments, in particular the cervical and thoracic rings, which are organized around the neck and intercostal muscles respectively, can also interfere. It's in this way that the diagram from earlier takes on a new significance. Tension has to move through a multitude of rings before it can be discharged. In summary, Wilhelm Reich's concept of character armor, which we can perhaps more accurately describe as muscular armor, is essentially a way of thinking about the body as storing trauma and anxiety into a number of interconnected segments that need to be collectively relaxed before those feelings are discharged. Leaving ergonomics behind, the third topic of today's video concerns what Deleuze and Guattari call Ritournelles, often translated into English as refrains or Ritournelles. Borrowing from ethology, they develop a concept based on the little tunes birds sing to mark their territory. When it comes to subjects, they play much the same role. Ritournelles are used to draw out elements from chaos and coalesce them into stable formations. As can be seen in this diagram, they're composed of three main components: a point of order, a circle of control, and lines of flight. Working in reverse order, the last refer to possibilities of evolution and change. The second concerns the many chaotic elements that make up a territory, named milieu by Deleuze and Guattari, and finally the first is what brings everything together. Central to the function of Ritournelles is their rhythmic repetition. A bird chirping once or twice doesn't make a territory. Instead, it's necessary to create fields of redundancy, places where the same thing occurs again and again and again, in order to stabilize the milieu. It's for this reason that Guattari describes existential territories, the last of the concepts we'll discuss in this video, as non-discursive. At the end of the day, there is no dynamic relationship between subjects that give rise to them, but rather only redundancies that break down any kind of distinction between expression and content. To give an example from my own work, Ritournelles can take the form of things like pronouns. They take a myriad of diverse heterogeneous milieu, from clothing choices to favorite activities, and organize them under a gendered territory. Their strength comes from a continual repetition, which gives consistency to the territory. Turning now to Guattari's own examples, explored primarily in his book The Machinic Unconscious, he singles out the narrator's Madeleine and Vinteuil's little phrase from Proust's In Search of Lost Time. Both take from a veritable universe of milieu, acting as individual points of order that coalesce territories in memory. Hearing a certain part of a sonata again, a redundant repetition, Swann is brought back to Odette and his love for her. Likewise, the flavor of a Madeleine carries the narrator away from his original territory to their house in Cambrai. It's on this note that we get to the penultimate concept we'll be going over today, what Lacan calls points de caption. These, which you might see variously described as quilting points, anchors, or even upholstery buttons, essentially act to allow signification or the production of meaning to function smoothly. To explain what this means, Lacan split the Swiss linguist Ferdinand de Saussure's concept of signs being composed of a signifier, a sound image, and a signified, a meaning. For him, the two aren't bound together, at least not at first. Instead, he conceives of them as two separated chains, the signified constantly slipping under the signifier. In other words, there's no intrinsic stable bond between them. Unlike Saussure, Lacan sees their relationship as incredibly unstable and fluid. It's only through quilting points that slippage can momentarily be stopped, giving the necessary illusion of stable meaning. It's this that is shown in this diagram, a knot between the two chains. Even though the operation of slippage still persists, just in a slowed-down form, we need illusions like this to function. By reining in signification, quilting points act as the framework on which communication can develop. However, not all individuals have enough of them. To be a bit more precise, those with a psychotic structure, like we discussed at the beginning of this episode, lack an adequate number of quilting points. This is what leads to the language-related symptoms of things like schizophrenia, characterized as it is by what is often called formal thought disorder. This manifests as the use of a large range of neologisms, words coined for the moment, along with generally incomprehensible speech. To wrap this up, quilting points also have a diachronic and a synchronic dimension. That's to say, elements both connected and disconnected to the unfolding of time. As seen here, the first denotes the way in which the meaning of a phrase is essentially sealed by its final element. In other words, as a phrase moves through time, there's always a point where the two chains of signification have to meet in order to make a comprehensible sentence. The synchronic side, on the other hand, is a bit more complicated. The Colin himself refers to it as hidden, connected to his wonderfully complicated concept of metaphor. However, to simplify somewhat, this refers to how science seemingly appears to the mind as permanent and unchanging, created from its own means as it were. Yet, as we've seen, this is nothing more than an illusion, the knotting operation that engenders it being something external rather than intrinsic. It's with this that we get to the last subject we'll be looking at today, Felix Guattari's notion of existential territory. This is something that we already touched on earlier with the section about Ritournelles, but to expand somewhat, existential territories are essentially the schizoanalytic response to the notion of an ego, as it is found in psychoanalysis. They correspond to all the different bits and pieces that make up the identity of subjects, from the home to friends and family. To give some more context, Guattari doesn't really agree with the idea that to be a subject means just to think, like Descartes would have it. Rather, his understanding of subjectivity isn't tied to individual people, but rather is more like a process formed from the intersection of elements like existential territories. They act a little similar to tectonic plates, shifting and colliding together to create new subjective formations. To take a bit of a step back, these, alongside incorporeal universes, machinic phyla, and material flows, compose Guattari's four functors, a set of notions that organize his understanding of ontology, outlined in his trilogy of the three ecologies, schizoanalytic cartographies, and chaosmosis. As can be seen in this figure from the second, the modality of existential territories is described by Guattari as virtually real, whilst incorporeal universes are considered virtually possible. Essentially, focusing on the possible real division, what this means is that the former exists as realizations of the latter. To use the same example as I did in my short on the functor, take the territory of a home. Here, there are all sorts of possibilities in how it can be furnished, arranged, modified, etc. In fact, one could go as far as to say that there are an infinite number of potential configurations, a whole universe of milieu as I described it earlier in this video. However, actually realizing those possibilities is another thing entirely. Unfortunately, we can't yet place IKEA furniture in superposition. It's in this sense that Guattari describes incorporeal universes as infinite and limitless, whilst territories are instead finite and limited. To give another example, we can return to the little phrase that reminds Swan of his love for Odette. There are endless possibilities implicated, with all sorts of feelings, memories, and desires existing side by side. However, the tune takes and organizes them into a specific coordinated thing, a territory of love. It's with this that we get to the creative side of Ritournelles. To paraphrase Guattari, they carry us away from the shores of our familiar territories, and into the cosmos of incorporeal universes, each with their own points of reference and sets of values. However, this isn't the only reason why Ritournelles are important for the two functors. Looking back to Guattari's table, what exactly does it mean for existential territories to be virtual? This is a question that, admittedly, I'm struggling with myself. However, from my current understanding, this is closely tied to the non-discursivity that characterizes them as something ordered by Ritournelles. The fields of redundancy that they form exist independently of regular causality, something that can be said about the phyla or flows. To return to our earlier example, what makes a home a home? It's quite difficult to pin down an exact cause or reason. Rather, it's through the interplay of non-discursive repetition and redundancy that it eventually gains such a status, something that Deleuze would probably describe as quasi-causal. In a word, existential territories can be defined as the non-discursive, limited realizations of incorporeal universes that, at least partially, make up subjects. It's on this note that I'd like to end this video, having now looked at all 5 shorts from last week. I truly hope you enjoyed or learned something, and if you feel I got anything wrong or wasn't as clear as I could have been, please do feel free to let me know in the comments so I can do better. This is something quite a bit different from usual, so I'd love some feedback on whether or not I should make this a regular thing or not. Next time, we're either going to be finishing off the 3 ecologies or looking at Freud's mourning and melancholia. It all depends on how the time works out. Until then, bye!